The afternoon sun bore down mercilessly on the city, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. The street buzzed with life. Cars honked impatiently, street vendors shouted their wares, and hurried pedestrians tried to cross before the light changed. But amidst the usual urban hustle, an invisible tension was brewing. On the side of the street, leaning casually against his patrol car, Officer Brad Halstead stood with a smug expression. His arms were crossed over his chest, and a mocking smirk played on his lips. His dark blue uniform was slightly unbuttoned at the collar, and his polished black boots gleamed in the sunlight. He was relishing the moment. "What did you just say?" asked the man standing before him. His tone was calm, but there was a sharpness to it that cut through the air like a blade. Officer Halstead knew exactly what he had said. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or a mistake. It was no accidental remark. It was a deliberate provocation. Monkey. The word lingered in the air, heavy and explosive, like a bomb waiting to detonate. The man Halstead had insulted wasn't just any pedestrian. His upright posture, his immaculate suit, and the confidence in his gaze spoke of someone accustomed to respect and wielding real power. His dark skin stood in stark contrast to the officer's arrogance as Halstead eyed him with a sense of superiority, as if his badge and uniform were all the authority he needed. "Yes, I said it," Brad repeated mockingly, as if testing how far he could push. "What are you going to do about it?" Around them, murmurs began to rise. A small crowd had gathered, watching the standoff with expressions of disbelief and anticipation. No one dared to intervene, but everyone knew something significant was about to unfold. The man remained unfazed. His expression was impassive, his dark eyes fixed on the officer, studying him, dissecting him. The calm before the storm. Then he took a step forward. Just one. But the simple act made the tension in the air almost unbearable. Brad felt a flicker of discomfort, though he refused to let it show on his face. He wasn't used to being confronted so fearlessly. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" the man asked, his voice soft but edged with steel. Brad let out a dry laugh. "Should I? What are you, some big-shot lawyer? You think your fancy suit intimidates me?" The man tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. But before he could respond, a sharp voice interrupted the scene. "Brad!" It was another officer, younger, his face pale and his jaw clenched. He had seen enough to know his partner had crossed a line. "Maybe you should—" the younger officer began, his voice tinged with nervousness. "Shut up, rookie!" Brad growled, not even sparing him a glance. "I've got this." The man watched the exchange silently, his face betraying no emotion. The patience of someone who knew the victory was already his. "Go ahead," Officer Halstead said with a forced grin. "Say what you got to say and get lost." The man took another step forward, now close enough that his words came out. As a near whisper, yet powerful enough for the entire street to hear. "Let's just say, you'll be seeing me again very soon." Brad's brow furrowed, his rigid stance betraying a flicker of unease. Something in the man's tone made the mockery on his face falter for just a moment. Then, without another word, the man turned and walked away with the same calm demeanor he had arrived with. The crowd watched in silence as his figure disappeared into the traffic and throng of pedestrians. It was as though something monumental had just happened, though no one yet understood the magnitude of its impact. Brad stood frozen, his jaw tight and his pulse racing. "Who the hell was that guy?" he muttered, but no one answered. He would find out soon enough, and when he did, his world would change forever. The city never slept. The relentless pace of cars, whispers on street corners, and the distant sound of sirens composed the constant soundtrack of Los Angeles. Inside the district police station, officers were busy with their daily routines, writing reports, reviewing case files, and answering calls. But that morning there was a different energy in the air. A new chief was about to take command, Daniel Carter. For some, just a name. For others, a symbol of inevitable change. When the station doors swung open, everyone looked up. A tall man in a dark suit with confident strides crossed the threshold, exuding the composure of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into. Daniel Carter didn't need words to assert his authority. His presence spoke volumes. Some officers greeted him respectfully, others barely nodded, their skepticism evident, and a few, like Brad Halstead, wouldn't even bother hiding their discomfort. Brad wasn't at the station at that moment, but if he had been, things might have gone differently. Daniel walked through the hallways, taking everything in, the glances, the forced smiles, the hushed whispers. He knew many didn't want him there, not because they doubted his qualifications, but because his mere presence was a threat to the old school of policing. He didn't care. Daniel wasn't there to be liked, he was there to clean house. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to take a walk through the city. He liked to see the people he had sworn to protect with his own eyes. That's when he saw it. Brad Halstead. He was standing next to his patrol car, questioning a young black woman whose trembling hands gripped the steering wheel. Daniel noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way she avoided eye contact with the officer. He knew exactly what was happening. He approached calmly. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice firm but free of aggression. Brad barely glanced at him. "Move along. Police matter." Daniel didn't budge. "I'm asking if there's a problem." The young woman in the car looked at Daniel, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Brad turned fully, now facing the man in the suit before him. He didn't recognize him. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel smirked slightly, not answering right away. It was a test. He wanted to see how far Brad would go without realizing who he was dealing with. "Just someone watching, making sure everything's done fairly." Brad let out a dry laugh. "Fairly? Come on, buddy, don't play the hero." Daniel held his ground. "Did she do anything illegal?" "She ran a yellow light," Brad said with disdain. "And she got nervous when I pulled her over." Daniel frowned. "So her crime is being nervous?" Brad gave him a mocking smile. "Look, Mr. Fancy Suit, if you want to give speeches, go to TV. Out here on the streets, we decide how things are handled." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He calmly pulled out his phone and started typing something. Brad scowled. "What the hell are you doing?" Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked him squarely in the eyes. "Just making sure this moment is documented." The air grew heavy with tension. Some pedestrians had stopped to watch, sensing the confrontation escalate. The weight of the situation was palpable. Brad felt a creeping discomfort climb his spine. For the first time in a long while, someone wasn't intimidated by him. "Listen, buddy," but Daniel cut him off. "We'll meet again." And with that he walked away. Brad stood there, feeling his authority crumble before an audience. And that infuriated him more than he was willing to admit. When Daniel returned to the station, the atmosphere had changed. Word of what had happened on the street had spread like wildfire. Some officers murmured among themselves, wondering who the man was who had humiliated Brad Halstead in public. Others, those who recognized the name Daniel Carter, began piecing it all together. When Brad Halstead stormed into the station, still fuming and ready to vent his frustration, he saw him, Daniel Carter, now wearing his police chief uniform. The two men locked eyes, and Brad felt the blood drain from his face. He had confronted him on the street without realizing who he was. He had insulted the new police chief in public. The station fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Daniel walked toward him with an unhurried stride. "Officer Halstead," he said, his tone formal, though there was a flicker of irony in his eyes. "I believe we've already met." Brad swallowed hard, feeling for the first time in years that he wasn't in control of the situation, and he hated that feeling. The murmurs in the station faded as Daniel Carter and Brad Halstead stood face to face. Brad felt a simmering rage building inside him. The authority he had spent years crafting through arrogance and intimidation was now teetering, all because of the man standing before him. Daniel, on the other hand, was completely composed. He didn't need to raise his voice or issue threats. His presence alone was enough to make Brad feel the weight of his own arrogance. The silence between them was interrupted by a nervous voice. "Chief Carter, would you like me to set up your office?" It was a young desk officer, one of the few who didn't seem uneasy with the arrival of the new chief. Daniel nodded but didn't take his eyes off Brad. "Yes, in a moment, but first I'd like to speak with Officer Halstead." Brad clenched his teeth. He knew what was coming. "In my office," Daniel added with a commanding tone that left no room for argument. Brad had no other choice. As they walked down the hallway, the tension was palpable. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others seemed to quietly relish seeing Brad in this position. When they reached Daniel's office, the door closed with a soft click. The silence inside was suffocating. Brad crossed his arms, trying to strike a defiant pose. "Are you going to lecture me, Chief?" Daniel leaned against his desk, his expression cold and calculating. "No, Officer Halstead, I'm going to explain exactly what's going to happen." Brad leaned forward with a forced grin. "Let me guess, you're going to make me write a report, force me to apologize to you in public?" Daniel studied him for a moment before replying, "I'm going to do something better. I'm going to review your entire record, abuse of power complaints, discrimination reports, every incident that was ignored before I got here." Brad's face paled slightly. "You're saying you're investigating me?" "I'm saying this department will no longer tolerate the behavior you've gotten away with for years." Brad let out a dry laugh. "So you're the big savior of the police? The man here to clean house?" Daniel kept his gaze fixed on him. "I'm the man who will make this badge mean more than abuse of power." A chill ran down Brad's spine. For the first time in his career, someone with more authority was putting him in his place. But he wasn't going down without a fight. "Good luck with that, Chief," he spat, turning to leave. "But let me warn you, not everyone here is on your side." Daniel let him walk out. He knew this was just the beginning. That night, Brad couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, replaying what had happened over and over. He couldn't believe someone like Daniel Carter had risen to the top of the department, and worse, he couldn't believe he was now under scrutiny. The next morning, when Brad walked into the station, he felt the stares on him. Some officers avoided him. Others seemed amused by the situation. But the worst came when his partner, Jacobs, the rookie, approached him with a tense expression. "Brad, we need to talk." Brad raised an eyebrow. "What is it, rookie?" Jacobs swallowed hard. "Look, Carter is digging into everything. All your reports, your interventions. He's talking to internal affairs and people in the community." Brad felt a stab of rage. "So what? I've got nothing to hide." Jacobs looked at him uncomfortably. "Brad, there are a lot of complaints about you. A lot that were ignored before, but Carter's not ignoring them." Brad felt his throat go dry. This wasn't just a warning, this was the beginning of the end, but he wasn't going down easily. Over the next few days, Brad pretended as if nothing was happening. He kept his defiant attitude, acting as though Carter didn't intimidate him, but inside, the pressure was building, until one night, he made a mistake that sealed his fate. It was a quiet night patrol, too quiet. Brad Halstead hated moments like these. When everything was too calm, his mind would start to spin, filled with frustrations, bottled-up anger, and a growing restlessness. Since the new chief had arrived, he felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Then, the radio call came. "Robbery in progress. Convenience store on 9th Avenue. Suspect still on site." Brad grabbed the radio quickly. "This is Unit 47, on my way." When he arrived at the store, Brad saw a young black teenager, around 17 years old, standing with his hands raised, trembling. The store owner was pointing to a food package. "He tried to steal this," the owner explained, "but I stopped him." Brad felt an inexplicable rage boiling up. "So you thought you could get away with it?" The boy tried to speak, but Brad shoved him against the wall before he could get a word out. Jacobs, who had arrived moments later, widened his eyes in horror. "Brad, wait! Shut up, rookie!" Brad barked. The boy was crying. "I wasn't trying to steal. I was hungry." But Brad wasn't listening anymore. Then he heard another sound. The click of a camera. Jacobs had turned on his body cam, and in that moment Brad knew he was finished. Jacobs, the rookie, on his first night patrol with Halstead, swallowed hard. "We're going to check things out first, right?" Brad shot him an impatient glare. "I don't need you teaching me how to do my job, kid." When they arrived, the cold lights of the convenience store flickered on the neon sign outside. The store owner, a nervous, middle-aged man, gestured frantically toward the inside. "He's still in there." Brad went in first, one hand resting on his holstered weapon, the other outstretched as if ready to issue commands. And then he saw him. A boy, no older than 17, stood at the far end of the aisle, trembling with fear. He was clutching a package of sandwiches in his hands. His wide eyes were filled with panic, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Jacobs took in the scene and immediately felt something was off. The boy didn't look like a criminal. "Did he take something?" Jacobs asked the store owner. "He grabbed that," the man pointed at the sandwiches, "but didn't pay." The boy finally tried to speak, his voice shaking. I was hungry." Brad dismissed him without a second thought. He advanced quickly, shoving the boy roughly against the shelves. "Hands behind your back," he barked, as if handling a dangerous criminal. The boy gasped in pain, tears welling up in his eyes. "Please, I'll pay, I swear. I didn't have money today." Jacobs felt his stomach churn. "Brad, calm down." "Shut up, Jacobs," Brad snapped. He pressed the boy against the cold metal of the shelves, gripping the back of his neck. And then there was a click. Jacobs' body cam had turned on. Brad froze for a moment, the sound echoing in his ears like a gunshot. He slowly turned his head and saw the small red light blinking on Jacobs' chest. Everything was being recorded. The silence between the three was suffocating. The store owner took a step back, sensing that something far bigger was unfolding. The boy sobbed quietly. Jacobs said nothing. He kept the camera running, capturing every second of the scene. In that moment, Brad Halstead realized his career was over. The recording was handed over the next morning. Daniel Carter watched the video in his office, not blinking once. Every second of Brad's abuse of authority burned on the screen. The shove, the threatening tone, the boy's panic. When the screen finally went dark, Daniel exhaled deeply. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Ramirez, prepare the paperwork. Brad Halstead is suspended effective immediately." The news spread through the station like wildfire. A veteran officer being suspended like that. Some couldn't believe it at first. Others, those familiar with Brad's temperament, knew it was only a matter of time. But no one had expected the fall to be so swift and brutal. Brad stormed into the station like a hurricane. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. But the looks he received were no longer the same. Once, officers respected him, or at least pretended to. Now they saw only a desperate man fighting against his own downfall. Daniel was waiting for him in the office, the suspension file open on the desk. When Brad entered, the door closed behind him. The two men stared at each other. "Sit down, Brad," Daniel said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. Brad crossed his arms. "You can't do this." "I already did." Brad gritted his teeth. "This is a witch hunt. You've been out to get me from day one." Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "You took yourself out of the game, Brad. I'm just making sure no one else gets hurt because of your arrogance." The silence fell like a death sentence. Brad knew it was true, and that hurt more than any punishment. When Brad left the office, the station felt different. It was no longer his territory. He looked around. Some officers avoided his gaze. Others whispered, "And Jacobs." Jacobs looked at him directly, without fear. That's when he understood. He no longer held power there, and he never would again. In the following days, the station underwent visible changes. Brad was gone, and with that, other officers who had once felt shielded by his abusive stance began to reconsider their actions. Jacobs was promoted, not for exposing Brad, but for having the courage to remain principled amidst the chaos. But the biggest change didn't happen inside the station. It happened on the streets. News spread quickly. Residents began to notice the difference. Police officers who once acted with impunity were now under closer scrutiny. Complaints were taken seriously, and Daniel Carter, he kept walking through the neighborhoods, listening to people, learning their stories, ensuring that the system began to work as it should. It was a long, difficult process. But little by little, the community started to trust again. And in the end, that was what mattered. Brad Halstead never wore a uniform again. He faded from public view, consumed by resentment and failure. Perhaps he learned his lesson. Perhaps he didn't. But in the end, that didn't matter, because Brad's story wasn't about him. It was about what happens when someone is finally held accountable for their actions. It was about how justice always finds a way to prevail, and most importantly, it was about how one person willing to fight for what's right can change an entire system. The question is, if you were in Daniel Carter's shoes, would you have the courage to stand up to the system? The story of Daniel Carter and Brad Halstead isn't just a tale about the abuse of power within a system. It's a profound reflection on accountability, leadership, and the fight for change in an environment where impunity has been the norm for far too long. Brad Halstead represented the old guard, officers who used their badge as a shield to justify their abuse. His arrogance didn't stem only from his uniform, but from the certainty that no one would challenge him until someone did. Daniel Carter, on the other hand, embodies the fight for true justice. Not the justice of empty speeches or superficial reforms, but justice built on actions, firm decisions, and the conviction that doing what's right is more important than being popular. The confrontation between these two men wasn't just a battle between individuals. It was a clash between two ways of viewing the world. On one side, unchecked power, systemic abuse and corruption disguised as authority. On the other, integrity, the courage to confront wrongdoing, and a commitment to the community. But the most important question isn't about Daniel or Brad. The question is, what would we do in their place? In a world where injustice has been normalized, where so many have been victims of abuse without being heard, would we be able to do what Daniel did? When we see someone being treated unfairly, when we witness abuse, when we know the system is failing, would we remain silent or would we act? Brad Halstead lost his position not just because of what he did that night at the store, but because he always believed he would never face consequences. He was convinced that power would shield him from accountability, but in the end, justice found its way. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't easy, but it happened. And that's the most important takeaway from this story. Change never happens overnight. The fight for justice isn't a single event, but a series of daily decisions. It's the officer who chooses not to look the other way when witnessing an injustice. It's the citizen who records abuse on their phone and reports it. It's the community that demands transparency and accountability. Because at the end of the day, change doesn't come from speeches or empty promises. Real change only happens when people are willing to act. Now the question is, are you ready to be part of that change? Share your thoughts in the comments and spread this story. Stories of justice, redemption, and change deserve to be told. If you enjoyed this story and want more content like this, give it a like below, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching.